It is my privilege and joy that we can continue our study that we started in the book of Daniel. Today we have the first chapter, and it's entitled From Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, before we enter into the subject of the chapter, let us review and see what is the purpose of all things. There is never a thing that was made without a purpose. And this book was written for the purpose to prepare teachers. For what time? For the last period of this earth, for the time of the end. What is the ultimate goal? It is to lead many to the path of righteousness. Who is the executive agent? It's the children of God, the teachers that He calls to do the job. What are the resources that they have? It's the revelation of the righteousness and love of God. And from where do they take this resource? It's from God's own action. How can we know God except we see Him in action? And according to all things, God is an active God. He is never passive. Passivity is non-existent in His kingdom. So that's why in the book of Daniel, we find revealed the actions of God in a special way. And understanding the action of God according to selflessness, to the basic law of God, we will interpret the Bible and this book correctly, and we will use this to become the teachers of this last time period. Now we have understood that the Bible contains information that is indispensable for life and salvation, and it is essential in all circumstances. And the same thing the book of Daniel contains. But the book of Daniel contains additional information for life and salvation, which is only essential in the last time. So we have seen that in our last presentation, the book of Daniel is essential for our time. That additional information that was given to Daniel 2,600 years ago is something that for us today is indispensable. So the additional information that some people say, oh, why do we need to know that? Well, if you are going to be a teacher of the truth, if you're going to fulfill the purpose that God has with you, then we must know the exact information for our time. That is an additional for the time of Daniel or for the periods before us. But for us, it is absolute essential. So let us look to the first chapter of Daniel, and we will look to this from the perspective of an acting God. So God gives. We find this in the first 2 verses in the first chapter. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and to Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, of course, he didn't take only the vessels, but it is mentioned here that the temple is not destroyed, but the vessels taken, the golden vessels, but he also takes prisoners. So God gives. It's an act of God. He gives King Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Why does God act in this way? We will see his action in this book again and again, and we want to give an answer to the why of God's action, because it looks like it's a negative action, does it? He does something that we would not usually do. Would you give your own children into the hands of the enemies? And then we see, on the other hand, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar gives also a command to select Jewish people, and then he commands them to give them new names. So they can do nothing about that because now they are under another dominion. Now they must have new names. We will speak maybe later about the importance of names, but will an outward name change an inward identity? Can he make them not servants of the living God by giving them names of servants of an idol? Of course not. So that's why there is no protest from the young men against that. But the king goes further. He commands what the students should have to eat and drink. Now that goes a little bit beyond the capacity of a human being to order on what another should eat or not. Well, God gave clear instructions, but his instructions are not in the way to limit someone, but to make it brighter. Under the circumstances of sin, God gave instruction what to not eat and what to eat, not in order to restrain, but in order to make power, in order to do the right. And so he gave not only to the Jewish people, but even before, at the time, from the beginning, there was a separation between clean animals and unclean animals. We find that right with Noah, where he puts into that ark the pairs of the unclean and clean animals. So it's important, the separation was already then made. But it was not only for the clean and unclean animals, like pork or no pork, but God also said blood should not be in the flesh you eat. And that is not only in the Old Testament, that goes also to the New Testament. The Holy Spirit made plain to the apostles in Acts 15 that they should abstain from eating the flesh with blood. Now, even if it would be clean animals, they would have had an issue because they would have to eat the blood from that animal. Because the heathen didn't cut or prepared the animal like God has ordered it to his own people to do. So it's not necessarily about food. It's about being obedient or being disobedient. But God uses a means that is so important, like food. We have to eat it every day in order to test or to advance the character of a human. So in verse 8 it says, "But Daniel proposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." Now, you see, it's about defilement, not about diet. But you can defile yourself, not only by bowing down to images, but also by using the wrong diet. Not as bringing you into difficulties, but as hope bringing you and making you brighter. So Daniel and his companions decide to not subdue to the command of the king. He proposed in his heart he would stay faithful to God. Isn't that a nice thing? I remember when I was 18 years old, I was called into the army in Romania under the communist regime. And of course, there you also get all kinds of food. No one asks you what to eat. And you must decide in your heart that you won't eat that which is unclean. And of course, God made provision that I got food that was clean. On the other hand, you would have no free time. You would have to work on Sabbath. You have to do the things that in the army needs to be done on Sabbath. And so I proposed in my heart, and I thank God for that grace, to not work on Sabbath, to be outside of the command of a man on Sabbath. And that decision, God gave results. And even when, I don't know, it was the second or the third Sabbath while in the army, the sergeant or whoever, I don't know how the grades are, commanded me and said, today you must come because we all go to make shooting exercises, and no one is exempt to remain in the dorm. And of course, I get out. I had to be there in the lines, but I said I cannot go. So I jumped out of the line. I went to one of the chiefs and I said I cannot go today. And he was graceful to me, and he said, okay, you can go into your dorm and rest on Sabbath day. So God is there. He will recompense, or how can I say, He will put us, if we decide in our hearts to not defile ourselves with that which is not godly, He will help us and lead us on. And so He gave success to these young people here in Daniel. They were smart. They didn't go against the command. Like some people they want to do the right, but they lack the wisdom, and so they oppose obviously things. They go to put themselves in front, and they don't know that they are led by their own deception. No, they were smart guys. So they go to the people and say, try it with us 10 days. So they don't go in offense, but they explain and they say, look, we could eat more humble food and it won't be bad for us. And they says, well, but if then you look worse, what shall I do? The king will kill me. And then they made that experiment. And God gives. It's not the food that gives that, but it's also the power of God in the food. But God gives Daniel and his friends health and a good-looking body in only 10 days. And since it's God who is with them and shows them the wisdom and they act accordingly, He gives them also the results. And after the whole 3 years, they are examined by the king. And the king command, verse 19 and 20, with them and among them all whose was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. I mean, they became his employers. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. That is God's giving. He gives wisdom and understanding. There is no other source of wisdom than God. And these are young people. There has been 16 they started. They might be now, after 3 years, they might be 19. But how much are you in experience when you're 19 or 20 years old? And here they are, 10 times wiser in their young age than all his magicians, than all the wise men. Isn't that the gift of God? Or is it what they owe their own selves? Yes, there is a co-working. We find their faithfulness and we see the result that God gives on faithfulness. And we won't see it only here in this chapter, but through all the chapters. And so Daniel and his friends are given positions in the serving of the king's palace. So he puts them there because they proved to be what he expected them to be, and even 10 times better. Now, we must understand basic actions about God's actions. There is one thing that I hear from my patients very often, and there are two common accusations that are given against God. They say, why does he not intervene? Why did he allow this to happen to me or to others? And why does he intervene like that? So people have questions. Why does he not intervene where we would obviously do something about? And there, when we might not intervene, he intervenes, and he intervenes in a way we wouldn't think that that's the right way to intervene. So the whole book of Daniel, but also the Bible, is about the intervention of God, his action. Why does God intervene, and how does those things function? That's why we want to have a basic understanding, so then we can understand or know and explain to those who have the question, because that's the role of teachers. They must have answers for the questions of those around them. So, very basic. The only source of all resources means in the universe is God himself. So there is no power except out of God. Nowhere. Nothing in his creatures has a power of himself. God gives his power, he's the source of it, as active elements because he's an active God. And he keeps all these elements in an active state. That's important. It's a very basic understanding. There's nothing that God doesn't keep actively going. What you see, the tablet, whatever it is, God must actively keep things going. But now he created the universe, and he made all creatures without exception to use these means, that is, to implement his active power. So since he's active, he made everything to be active like him. So they have no means of their own, but in order that the circle of the universe should function, everyone uses the means, the active means of God. That's why we have that fundamental law that we must understand, which will enlighten us, that everything must take, but not for himself, but to give. So you see, I never saw God. I don't think that you have seen it, but I know that God is love and justice. How do I know that? Because of his law of total selflessness. So the altruism in this whole creation is nothing that uses anything for himself. That proves to me that God is selfless, that he's love. He never does anything for himself because he does not need anything for him. And everything he does for the good of his universe. And he made that everyone in this universe should use his means, but not for him, but to give them on. Now, in all his creatures, he created spirits and souls that have a spirit with morals. That means they should do all things on their own responsibility. Now, this is a special creature that is made in the image of God, that has the ability to not only think, but to do things on responsibility. That is, God gives them a thing to do, like, let's say, he says, don't eat that, but all other things you can do. So he gives them certain purposes to do something, but then they have to use the means that he has put to disposition, how they know best to do it. That's the beautifulest of all creation, that we can govern ourselves. And we can use means like we think it's best, because God gave us our own responsibility. And as long as all the spirits that has morals would take up the responsibility, doing all things according to the law out of love, divine intervention, in between, God keeps all active, and he is always active, but he would not need to intervene in all those things because they would all go according to his law of love, and he would never need to intervene when something negative, when something happens. So that's how the universe works. And now Lucifer, the first angel, leaves his position due to his self-deception. It's an inexplicable self-deception that puts the whole universe in distress. It's a self-deception that he thinks he might be God, he does not need to take anymore, and a third of the angels follow him. Thus, by their self-deception, they separate from the source of all strength and life, and according to the way the universe works, must die immediately. Because if you take yourself out of the power source, you remain void. You can do nothing anymore. You are unable to function. Why does God intervene? That's his first intervention against the natural consequences. He stops them. He postpones them because they use his active power, and he still keeps them alive. Why does God intervene and not let things go like they happened? Because God has a universe that he wants to be run like he wants it to be run. We could say that. But it's a universe that he wants to be free of fear. You see, until then, no one knew about a law. They all fulfilled it because God built it in. And it's built in everything that we use, that you need power. You never need to ask for that. But now that this system was deranged because of a self-deception, fear starts to arise. And I know so many Christians that are so fearful to do something wrong. Now, I'm a fearful person as well, but amazingly, I don't have that I could do something wrong. Then they don't do that. Yeah. But why would you not do something wrong? Would it be out of reason? Would it be out of wisdom and understanding? Or would it be irrational? And fear is irrational. So God never wants that anyone in his universe that has morals to do anything out of a irrational, but means in calculating, oh, if I do this, I just might die as others have died. So fear would enter the whole universe, and God would not take it out again, because he could not take it out of Lucifer, because he made him to govern himself. He could only knock at his door and say, Lucifer, look, you are deceiving yourself. But he could not stop him. So God knows when things would happen like that, fear would be never taken away from the universe. And all the spirits with morals would just follow him because of an advantage and avoiding a disadvantage. And that is not in God's interest. And I thank God that it's not in God's interest. And so he says, I intervene. I keep the evil alive for the purpose to show where self-deception brings. So that at the end of the whole thing, every being that has morals in the universe is convinced that you don't need to do anything out of fear, but just out of conviction. And since the devil attacked and says, God is not just and he is not selfless, he uses you for himself. So having that accusation, God wants to help his creatures to get out of it. That's why he didn't stop creating, and he created Adam and Eve, and they became subject to the same self-deception. And he told them, you will die the day you eat. But we still are alive. It's 6,000 years later. Adam's life is still there. Why don't they die immediately? but are kept alive artificially. Why? Why does God not give the results of that self-deception so that everyone should see where it leads, so that everyone should fear him? That's not his purpose. That's why he puts this earth, and he gives, because here Adam and Eve fell and Lucifer took them, so to say, as his prisoners. He takes the history of this earth and he put a timeline of 7,000 years to finish, to remove the self-deception, so that no one in the universe fears him for any reason that, oh, I'm afraid to do this or that. No. He wants to have a free universe in which all those with morals do things right because they like them. They know it is right. So that he does not need to intervene anymore in this kind of way. So Adam separates himself and God makes a plan, and he made it before, to remove the self-deception, not only from those who fell into it, but also from those who would be maybe in danger. And that would be the whole universe of the beings that have morals. And so in order to remove the self-deception, he needs the cooperation of the humans. Because it's impossible to remove something out of me except I have to do it. Because God cannot enter me and he can add things to me. We'll see what his abilities are to build the spirit, but he never made the spirit that he should govern him. So that's why he needs the cooperation of those who walk with him. So that's why he started from the flood, Exodus. I have put a few things here. The first coming of Christ, then the time of the end, second coming, the third coming. And from the beginning, the battle is to remove self-deception. And the first man, seventh after Adam, it's Enoch. And Enoch is the one that through the grace of Christ, he becomes the first from those who have born into deception to be freed from self-deception. And he's taken up to heaven after 330 years. God continues with Noah. He continues with Abraham. Always the same purpose, to bring a light. And light means truth, means the opposite of self-deception. They should be a light to the whole world. They didn't fulfill it. Then he went to the apostles and the church that follows, and we know the history. It's not a nice history, but we know, according to his prophets, that in the end time, the promise given to Abraham will be fulfilled. And then follows the millennium and the final judgment after that millennium. So the whole period is 7,000 years. Now, what is 7,000 years compared to eternity? It's nothing. So it's a short time in which God accomplishes for his whole universe, not for himself, because he needs nothing for himself, that they should be out of self-deception. And the book of Daniel plays a major role in this thing. It was written here before Christ 600 years, but his purpose is for the end time for us. That's why we study Daniel. And so we will have to give to the world a message of truth. Everyone who will see self-deception must take a decision. And if he sees self-deception and still remains it when he could come out of it, then God cannot help. And so we will see that in the book of Daniel especially. Now, how did Daniel come? Why did God intervene? We put that question at the beginning, and gave Jehoiakim into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. Let's look a little bit to the history. Here are the kings of Israel and Judah. God called Israel to be a special people. They should have no king, but they wanted a king, so God gave them a king. And so they had the first king, Saul, and then they have the second king, David, and then they have the third king, Solomon. And then Solomon, even though God gave him great wisdom, fell apart, and after him, the 12 tribes were separated into 10 and 2. Judah and Benjamin remained together, and the other 10 tribes formed the city or formed the country of Israel. And that happened about 930 before Christ. And then we see the very sad history that the people who were called to be the light of the world, they go in darker and darker place. And after 200 and something years, he must bring them into destruction. 722, 721, the kingdom of Israel is destroyed and eliminated from to be the light. Now in Judah and Benjamin, things don't go better, but a little bit slower. So they come into the time of Jehoiakim. It was the third last king before the final destruction, the final captivity of Babylon. So God gave grace. Jehoiakim could repent, Zedekiah could, but none of them. They went on until God could not do for them more than giving them up into the captivity. That was about 606, 605 before Christ. So there we find God's effort to make the descendants of Abraham the light of the world. That is, that they should be that people that show self-deception and show the truth, so that everyone can take a decision to remain in that self-deception or to be taken away from that self-deception. So here we have that God gives Jehoiakim. But why does he give it? To destroy or to save? When God intervenes with destruction, does he want to save or wants to destroy? Does he have any pleasure in destruction? No, because in that he never did anything to not go on. So he is not the one that likes destruction. But when he intervenes in a destructive way, he intervenes always for salvation purpose. So he brings that remnant that always is there in his people to be the light of the world, in spite of the falling apart of the whole tribes. So he puts a few people out. And so Daniel and his friends become the light of the world. He puts them where he wants to put them, and he still fulfills his purpose. Not like originally wanted, but he intervenes to fulfill his purpose. And that's we should never forget, to keep out of the human mind and of those from the universe, to destroy self-deception. So let us go into this study and become those teachers that God needs in the end of time, that will bring the total light to the world, that show the truth about God, about his righteousness, not in a theoretical way, but in a practical way, like this young people. Will you want to be among them? I hope so. I want to be one of them, in which, like Enoch, self-deception is totally removed, and I can become the light of the world like God called us to be, that bring righteousness and the love of God in a practical way to all the people. Amen.